Hi everyone, my name is Isabella Sciacca. I'm the president of the Young Economists for the Economic Society of Australia Queensland branch, and I'm joined by Danielle Wood, chair of the Productivity Commission and co-founder of the Women in Economics Network. Today we will talk about the evolving field of economics, the benefits of studying it, and how it can be used to solve some of our most pressing problems. Thank you very much for joining me, Danielle.
Thank you for having me.
I'll start us off with our first question. Productivity growth is at its slowest rate in 60 years, and the Australian government has said that productivity will be a focus for this term of Parliament. You've said Australian policymakers need to take a growth mindset when it comes to economic reform. What would that look like, and why is kickstarting productivity important?
Well, thank you for starting there. Obviously, something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So look, when I'm talking about a growth mindset, what I'm really getting at is I think we need to prioritise the importance of productivity growth and therefore economic growth in our policymaking processes. And, when you go out and you sort of talk to people in the economy, whether it's, big business, whether it's small business, whether it's people in the not-for-profit sector, they will just tell you this story of increasing regulatory burden, more time spent on compliance costs, all of these things sort of taking them away from doing the things they do. And that's meant it's a lot harder to build things, whether it's houses or infrastructure. It's harder and more expensive to deliver services. So all of the things that contribute to a good life in this country are getting more challenging to provide. And so, that's not to say that other objectives that government will pursue with policy are not important. There will be sometimes needs to go after social and environmental objectives. But what we're saying is to not trade away those benefits of growth lightly. They really matter. And so to your question of why it matters, productivity growth is really the only way we get sustainable improvements in wages and incomes over time. So, why does the average Australian today have income 3 times higher, work less, have better health than the average Australian in 1960? It's because we've had extraordinary growth in our productivity. And as you say, things have stalled in recent times. The most immediate manifestation of that is we had young people born in the 1990s, sort of late millennials, hitting the jobs market in the 2010s when growth was stagnant. They were the first generation not to earn more than the people born 10 years before at the same age. And so, this really matters for this sort of expectation that we have of generation and generation improvement in living standards. So it's absolutely critical that we get productivity growth moving. Government's only one piece of that, but that growth mindset is really about making sure that sits front and centre in the government's agenda.
Yeah, no, that sounds really important, and I think it shows a little bit how economics needs to evolve and what's forefront of mind sometimes. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the field of economics has evolved since you started studying it, and how does economics as a discipline today help decision makers better deliver reforms?
Look, so I think it's probably two sizable changes since I was studying it, and it was quite some time ago now. But I think better interaction and pulling in of other disciplines and the ideas from other disciplines is one area, and the most obvious I think is psychology and behavioural economics. So a little anecdote from when I was at university. I actually studied psychology first year alongside economics, and I went to the kind of careers advisor and I said, should I do both together? Is there any point in bringing these two things together? And they said, no, there's no overlap between these two things. And then a couple of years later, I started reading behavioural economics papers. I was like, oh my gosh, terrible advice. But, it just was not mainstream in the way that it is now. Now, I think, we embed some of those ideas that we don't have perfectly rational agents at the end of policy decisions. So we have to actually genuinely think about people's biases and how they respond. The second big change is just a huge increase in the availability of data and the computational power to be able to use that data. And in the policy world, the real game changer has been sort of linked and distributed data. So I can now get, data for everyone in Australia, linked up, their incomes from their tax records, what health services they're using, where they live, who their parents are, and you can imagine the kind of richness of that pitch and bang, which allows you to kind of really understand policy and policy changes at a more granular level. So I think that's kind of supercharged our capacity to deliver good evidence-based policy. Also means we can do much better evaluation of policy, so we can understand better what works and what doesn't. So those have been, I think pretty, frankly, really exciting developments in the past 20 years.
No, that is definitely some really interesting aspects that she has evolved. And I think it must be quite interesting, especially when we look at the benefits of studying economics and for understanding challenges such as intergenerational inequality and identifying potential solutions.
Yeah, that's right. So I think, it's economics is a framework, and that's not a new observation by any stretch, but it gives us a way of breaking down thinking about problems that is relevant to all sorts of areas of policy. But, the intergenerational one is one that I've written a lot about, I think is really important. And, I think what economics brings is, first of all, there's quite a lot to unpick if you start talking about intergenerational inequality. So there's lots of, and, I've largely done that in an economic sense. There's other aspects. You could start talking about climate and all sorts of things, but if we just think about kind of economics for a moment, there's lots of different dimensions of economic well-being. There's your income, there's your wealth, there's your employment status, there's your consumption. So we actually kind of need to understand these different variables and how they work together. There is just a need to unpack the time dimension. So, it would be silly to look at older households and look at younger households and say older households have more wealth and therefore we've got a problem with intergenerational inequality. Well, of course they do. They had longer to accumulate that. What we're more interested in is how those patterns have changed over time between older and younger households. We might also want to look at, differences in behaviour. Are people working more or less? Are they saving more or less? That might account for some of those differences. And it's really only after controlling for all those different factors that we could hand on heart say that maybe we've got a problem, that the young people are doing it tougher, let alone before we start thinking through what the right policy responses might be needed. So, economics gives us the framework to think really systematically through each of those issues. It also gives us the capacity to go out and find and analyse the data that we need to answer those questions.
No, that's very important aspects, and I think important as well when you do compare what is actually happening in the data. And then a little bit more about applying different economic techniques. How can we, with using and conducting robust analysis, how does that help when measuring productivity in the care economy?
That's a very challenging topic. When the ABS compiles productivity measures, and I'll offer that labour productivity here to keep it simple, so kind of the value produced per hour worked, in a lot of sectors of the economy, it's really important to control for quality changes. So, you can think of things like, this mobile phone looks really different to a mobile phone did 20 years ago, or houses today are bigger than they were 20 years ago. And so the ABS has actually got ways for adjusting for that. That's relevant to productivity, right? Sometimes we take the gains through better quality. So they've got ways of doing that. Those adjustments don't occur when it comes to the care economy. That's just because it's hard. And so we've started to think about, how you might do this. We started with healthcare, and it's probably because it's the easiest of the care sectors. And what we found is, if you start thinking about quality and health, the moment we measure output by, say, the number of patients treated, but the health system is there to actually make us healthy. So why don't we try and measure what's happened in terms of health outcomes? And so we need to control for all sorts of things that might make a difference to people's health outcomes. So we want to be just measuring the impact of the system itself. But what we did is pick a subset of chronic diseases, and we adjusted for health outcomes of people's healthy, the way they live their lives when they have those diseases compared to the inputs. And what we found is actually productivity much more high much higher than what the ABS is measuring. So if you look at the health system in the national accounts, it looks like productivity grew by about 0.1% over the past decade. Once we adjust for better outcomes for those diseases, it's more like 3%. So we've had these big productivity gains that we've taken them in terms of better quality. So you can imagine some of that same dynamic may be there for other care sectors, for aged care or disability care or childcare. Harder to think about how you actually measure that quality component. We are doing some more thinking about this. So this is a project that we've kind of got on our future list for try to, maybe use some of the publicly available data that's out there that goes to quality, whether that's kind of surveys of people's experience, inspector reports, other things that we might be able to do to kind of try and see if we can do this quality adjustment in other parts of the care economy.
Yeah, and I think that's super important because they are then the impacts that we experience in day-to-day life.
Yeah, exactly.
And so a little bit more, for students studying economics, can you describe the impacts of economics in the real world, particularly how it can help build a resilient nation capable of overcoming current and future uncertainties?
Yeah, economists can do everything. Right. No, I mean, it is so critical. I mean, it's economics is so embodied in, or embedded, I should say, into policy frameworks. We used to have a fantastic high school teacher that was involved in the Women in Economics Network Committee early on, and she used to say economics is the language of policy, which I think is such a nice way to talk about it. But I think, there's a macro and a micro dimension to this. So I think we have our understanding of macro policy and macro responses to crises in particular has meant that we have been more successful in navigating more recent crises than we have in past. So if you think about the Asian financial crisis, the GFC, COVID, really big shocks that Australia has come through relatively well. Like, no one's going to say it was perfect.
Yeah.
And I'm talking, on the economic side here, but we didn't end up with unemployment. Incomes were buffeted. There's lots of things we can learn. One was, GFC was a big demand side shock, COVID was a supply side shock, so the responses were different, but we had the frameworks of thinking about how they had to be different and what the kind of right levers to pull were. And economists were embedded enough into decision making to allow those policies to get rolled out. And, frankly, we're better off as a nation because of that. So I think that's one area, the kind of macro side. And then the micro side, as you know, it's really about how do we think about unleashing the best out of our economy, the potential of the Australian people, but also how do we set ourselves up to success when responding to big challenges like climate. And so, that's an issue that we take advice from the scientists on around the scale of the challenge and what needs to be done. But then it's economics that helps us with the tools to get us there at the lowest cost possible way. So, I see economists, front and center in climate policy, in health policy, in, looking at questions of inequality and mobility. So like all these kind of really big challenging issues, those economic frameworks and economists have a really important role to play.
Yeah, definitely. And I think taking a little bit more as well, looking at the future, what do you think the future role of an economist will be given the changes expected in workplaces due to AI?
Look, this is a hard one, and I have proved myself to be a terrible futurist over time. But, look, let's look at the evidence from kind of past technology changes, and there's been work as well looking particularly at AI from Jobs and Skills Australia, which is a fantastic outfit that employs a lot of economists. And, what they've suggested is for lots of jobs, and I don't think they've specifically looked at economists, but, when I think through their logic, I think it applies. Probably augmentation will be the bigger part of the story with AI than replacement. So I don't think we're going to have kind of AI economists, running Treasury or the RBA anytime soon. But what I do think is there are aspects of the different tasks that sit behind being an economist where AI will be able to help. So, if you think about what we do, we research, we analyze data, we apply frameworks, we package it up and communicate. All of those different tasks, I think AI has a role to play. It will be a good augmenter. It will hopefully make us more productive at doing all of those things. But I don't think it's a replacement for the kind of human judgment that you need to do those things well. So I think that will be overlaid with, depth of economic experience and judgment. The other thing I think AI is less good at is coming up with genuinely innovative ideas. By its nature, it's, feeding off the past stock of things that have been written before. So, I think, as I said before, sometimes it's combining disciplines and applying different ideas and bringing thoughts together from different areas that lead to fresh ways of thinking or new breakthroughs. And I think that still remains a human skill as well. So I hope to see a very healthy economics profession full of people with great judgment sitting there using these great tools that make us better at what we do. But, I think there'll very much still be a pipeline of economists needed to shape the country well into the future.
Thank you very much for your time today, Danielle. And thank you very much for taking us through the journey of economics and what the future will hold. I'm sure there'll be many economists helping us overcome some of the challenges and to a more prosperous and productive Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.